Hey, what's up? So I want to make this video talking about how I optimize my render settings for the work that I do and how I optimize my Blender scene. So that's going to be the two parts of this video, all of the settings, the numbers, the checkboxes, and then all of the things that I do and I try and tricks and things like that on the actual geometry of the scene to make it run as fast as possible. I'm super impatient. Because of that, I have learned a lot of things, some of which I understand, some of which I don't, and started applying them and kind of having a running list of things that I go through and how I optimize the settings and then how I optimize the scene. So yeah, let's just jump straight into Blender. Okay, so first thing, just using the latest version of Blender is gonna be, I think, a good general thing to do because they're always optimizing it, they're always adding stuff, making cycles a little bit faster, making Eevee a little bit faster. This video is gonna be mostly focused on cycles. Eevee has its own whole workflow that I can make a whole separate video about, and I'm more than happy to make a video about that. Just let me know in the comments if you're interested in that. Anyway, I'm gonna go through and I'm gonna do a load factory settings. If I downloaded Blender for the first time, these are all the things that I would go through. I do wanna mention one more thing is that my computer is a bit on like the medium to high end. It's for rendering, this is like my primary use for the computer. I did start learning Blender on like a 970. So I've been using Blender for a long time and I've used it on weaker machines. And I was always consistent about applying a lot of these things that I'm going to show to speed up my renders. So even if I don't need to apply them now, I still do because even just like a split second less render time, I'm down for it. Okay. First thing is to go into preferences and go into system and enable the render devices for cycles. So for PCs with a RTX card, you're going to want to turn on optics. There's, I guess, general questions about what is the difference between optics and CUDA. And I think, and this is again, like, I'm not really super technical in this stuff, but from the limited Reddit headlines that I've read, essentially with optics, they touch the RTX cores. I don't know how it works. The tentacles of the optics machine go into the RTX cores and they meet and they fall in love. RTX cores get activated by optics and that makes it run a little bit faster. Again, you might have to play around with the turning it on, turning it off, make tests for yourself, see what works for you. But yeah, that's the first thing I would do here. Oh, one more thing. If you have a MacBook or something with like Metal or M1 or M2 cards, you're gonna enable that here because I know a lot of people who work on MacBook who just don't, who forget that that's an option. So now let's transition over here to the juicy render settings. By default, the device will be set to CPU, set that to GPU, And I think for me, this is again, for me, could be a hot take, I don't know. These settings are way too high. For viewport, I turn on denoise. I set this to like 16. That isn't good enough for me. And noise threshold up 0.5. And for this is for the viewport. So this is for looking at stuff in the viewport. For me, I just need to see the color. I need to see the shape. I need to see the lighting, and then everything else can be blurry. I don't care. If I really, really want to see it, I will do a render, a test render. And then for the render, these max samples are way too high. Even for a still render, I don't render this high. I render at like, for a still render, if I had to go high, I would render 1024 for the highest. But I'm usually comfortable around either 256 or 512. And again, this number you can test, render at 256, see how it looks, render at 512, see how it looks, and then adjust the noise threshold accordingly. So I'm going to turn this to 0.05. 512 is fine with me, denoise. And if you are rendering with an RTX card and you've enabled optics, just go in here and change the denoiser to optics. So all right, so that's what I do. Noise threshold, all that kind of stuff, that just kind of, I think, again, 30% knowledge on noise thresholds and how that work. I think that's just when the denoising is enabled. So how long does your image stay noisy until the denoise gets applied? So if the noise threshold is higher, it will denoise sooner, which means that the image would be done sooner. Again, you can play with that. Light paths, so I immediately turn off the reflective and refractive and the caustics. And then oftentimes, max bounces, reducing those can help a lot too, because this is just how much the light is bouncing around. So for transmission, which is something like glass and water, if you don't have any glass and water in your scene, you can turn that to like 1 or 0. Same thing with transparent, you can turn that down. And then the total, you can turn it down to like 8. You can really mess with this stuff a lot, and it can really help speed up your renders because that's just how much the light is bouncing around and all this kind of stuff. Again, gauge this against what your art direction is, what the look that you're going for is, and what you're willing to compromise like on the rendering. There's also presets here that you can choose. So the default changes it back to that. Direct light makes it a lot more smaller. Next up is performance. So performance, because I usually do a lot of animations, I turn on persistent data, and if you kind of hover over any setting here in Blender, it will give you a little pop-up that sometimes tells you what it does. Sometimes it just says like technical jargon that still doesn't make any sense. So in my experience, I notice a decrease in render times, but I don't notice any difference to my RAM or anything like that. Essentially what it does is it will, from my understanding, again, very loose understanding, if you're rendering an animation or a sequence, let's say, and only one thing in the middle is moving, like the character is moving, but the sides and the background is not moving that much, it will kind of remember that data and then apply it to the next frame so that it cuts the render time. So it can be like 1 minute for the first frame, 1 minute for the second frame, maybe 59 seconds for the second frame, 58 seconds for the third frame or fourth frame, whatever. And just kind of on average, it'll kind of slow down. Again, play around with that, see how it works for you. And I have one piece of advice for testing these settings. So let's say you want to see how long something, with persistent data, you have to render multiple frames for you to notice a difference. But let's say you want to try the samples or the threshold. So if I jump into the camera view and I'm going to add a plane here, so we will render this image. This took a second, less than a second. And it looks like this. You can go up here to this slot area and select slot 2, and this will kind of get rid of your render. It's still saved to slot 1. So when you go to slot 2, you can just close this. Let's change this noise threshold to 1 and then render image. And then that took 30.30 whatever milliseconds or something less. So you can compare and contrast. So let's say this is an important area for your animation or for your still render. And you're like, I really need this part to be detailed and clean and sharp. And so this was at 0.05 noise threshold, took a second. This one, I just switched to it and even I didn't notice a difference. And this one took 30 milliseconds less, and it was rendered with 1 threshold, like a number of 1. I don't know what the unit of measurement is, but you know, that can kind of, I think, help you a lot. And I definitely did that a lot for my scenes. And sometimes I still do that for scenes where I'm like, what is going to give me the best result for the least amount of time? So let's even try this. Let's go to slot 3. Let's make the sample 16, keep the noise threshold at 1, and let's see how long that takes. Okay, that took a little bit less. Like it didn't take a lot less, but it took a little bit less. So the one before that was like 60. This one is 54, but we can zoom in here and we can see, okay, this is starting to get a little bit weird. Like we're getting a bit of like painterliness and some smudginess, but you know, overall, not that much of a difference. That's why I mentioned the importance of what is the art direction for your scene? You know, what is the style? Like what's the focus of the artwork? Also, is this going to be a giant 4K render, a 4K animation that you're looking for, people are going to be looking at really closely? Or is this just going to be a short animation on your phone? The next couple things I want to get into are kind of like the optional things in the, you know, like if you have a camera, like one thing that I've noticed is if you have depth of field, sometimes that can, you know, just be aware that that might increase your render times by a lot. Using motion blur is kind of like the opposite of depth of field as far as how I would use it. So depth of field is a cool looking thing that can add a lot to your render time, but motion blur can actually help you because if your camera is shaking and it's kind of moving around a lot, you can kind of get away with rendering with higher noise threshold because that whole sequence is going to be blurry and stuff anyway. And lastly, when you're rendering inside of your scene, Cycles likes it when there's a lot of lights. So use an HDRI if you can. Using an HDRI can kind of light more areas, even if you turn the HDRI way down, like turning the strength way down and still include a light in there. Kind of having more general light fill in some of the darker spots renders your scenes a little bit faster. And then if you need to darken them, you can, you know, darken them artificially in your editing software or darken them afterwards in like maybe the compositor or something like that. In general, just having more lights in your scene can really help your scene run a little bit faster and render a little bit faster. One more thing to do, and this is just a good practice thing to do, is if you have a ton of objects that you've been making for your scene and you're like deleting some things, or while you're working on your scene, you're making a bunch of materials, you're deleting those materials, all of these kinds of things that you're making create data blocks and stuff in the background. So one good thing to do, and I always do this for my scenes, if I notice my scene is starting to run slow or things are kind of bogging down, is you go to this cleanup in file and then just unused data blocks, just purge them, delete them. I kind of do this when I'm close to the end of my project and I'm pretty happy where everything is and it's still running slow. Let me go run through and clean up my scene. Unused local data blocks, recursive, all that kind of stuff. I mean, I've deleted I've clicked on all of this stuff for some of my scenes and I didn't notice a visual change, and it does kind of help clean up your scene, clean up the clutter and stuff in the background. Okay, so now that we're kind of tinkering with the scene, let's jump into the other half of what I do and go into the scene settings. Here we have a scene open, and this is a scene that I made for my Instagram. It was a really cool render of an Ava standing in the city. I thought it was really, really epic, and it was a model that I commissioned a good friend of mine to make, and you know, he spent a while working on it. I was really excited. He just did a killer job, so I really wanted to show it off, and I want to keep making more artwork with it. I have a whole plan for Evangelion themed artwork, so if you want to see a lot of that stuff, just follow me on Insta and Patreon. Those are all good places for it. Anyway, I'm going to use this scene as an example. And this scene was originally rendered with Eevee. So if I jump into the Eevee settings, you can kind of see that it looks really good. It starts up really fast. I think it's a really good example for us today with cycles, because there's a lot of geometry in this, as you can see, and there's a lot of stuff that's pretty heavy, especially the Ava. It's a very high poly model. So the first thing is something that I've noticed in my work. Textures around 4K, especially a lot of them, can start to really, really slow down my scene and really affect the VRAM in my scene statistics. So if you ever want to see what's going on with the VRAM, maybe something is slowing down, you can go down here to the where it says like the Blender version and right click and enable scene statistics, and it'll show you like the faces, all the stuff that's going on, and or you can turn on video memory. So that's VRAM, and you can already see it's just sitting on one frame, and because the scene is so dense, it's already almost maxing out my VRAM. If you sometimes watch videos from creators you like and you think, how the hell are they making these scenes? They look amazing, and they're using photo scans and volumes and lights and what? Take a look down here, see how much VRAM they have. This, I think, can help you figure out sometimes immediately why your scene is running slow. So textures for me have been one of the biggest things that have caused my scene to slow down. So if you're using PBR textures from online, try to find the 2K version, or if you can open the image textures individually in like Photoshop or something, try lowering them down to 2K. There's also add-ons and things like that and plugins you can buy that will do all of this stuff automatically for you, just kind of like collapse things and decimate things for you. But that would be kind of the first thing to look out for, is what is the resolution of the textures that you're using? Are they 4K? Are they 8K? And then how many are there? So if I jump into like the Ava, for example, and jump into the shader editor, you can see that there's kind of a lot going on here. And for a lot of textures, a lot of PBR textures, sometimes you'll get the base color, the metallic, the roughness, the normal, and then a displacement. And for me personally, the displacement texture is not important. So if I'm using a 4K PBR texture, I really just need color, roughness, and normal. Like that is kind of enough for what I'm going for. If you're really trying to optimize your scene, I would go through and select a node and hit M, and it will mute it. And if you look at your scene and if you notice any major differences or not, and I would highly recommend, of course, saving out a version of your scene, of your file, you know, saving a new version that you can start experimenting and applying some of these changes to. So check your textures, check the resolution on them, and check the amount of image textures you have in your materials. The second thing that I would highly recommend is, you can see I'm doing that a little bit here. I have collections, and start breaking your scene down into the parts that are visible and then the parts that are hidden. So in this collection here that's grayed out, it's called hidden. So this Ava, you can see that there's parts that are missing, like the hands are missing, the legs are all missing. And that's because when I go to my camera view and I kind of scrub through, you never really see that part at all. And I could even go as far as, so if you jump into your camera view and in the camera settings here, There's the passepartout at the bottom. You can also turn it down, and usually it's around like 0.5 for most people. So here gives you a good idea of what is visible the whole time throughout the animation. So this entire left piece is not visible. So I can select it. So if I go into edit mode, I'm going to select this. I'm going to separate it with P. And now it's its own object. I'm going to press M to move it to a new collection. I'm going to move it to the hidden collection. So now it's hidden. And because it's not just hidden with the eyeball, it's completely disabled with the checkbox. It's not loading that data in my scene. I'm not even going to turn it on because it's going to just bump up the VRAM. So now that piece that I've hid, if I play this in the camera view, you never see that part. So it doesn't even matter that it's gone. So again, this is going to depend on your scene, on your animation, on your camera angle, what's going on. So kind of go through and try to organize your scene layers in that way, and then disable and enable stuff based on what you need. The other thing you can do is, let's say you can't hide the objects in certain layers, you can look at decimating them. And I've noticed that specifically with photo scans, for example. So I've got some photo scans from Ian Hubert, and I'm just gonna use one of these scans as an example. So let's say I bring in this giant cement chunk. And let's say you're kit bashing, you're using assets from all kinds of things. I've noticed specifically with photo scans, if the detail of it is really high, for this one it's not that high, but if it's really high and you want to bring down the amount of geometry it is without destroying like the UV and the faces and things like that, for photo scans, you can usually go in and add a decimate modifier and then keep it on collapse and then bring this number down to, let's say, 0.5. It decreased the amount of faces. So at 1, it was at 1600, and at 0.5, it's 8000, but the geometry looks almost the same, pretty much the same. You can see what happens when you decrease it. It kind of like jitters and moves around a little bit, but for the most part, nothing is really noticeable, and you've just cut your poly count down by half. So if you're using photo scans and assets, things you might have downloaded, random stuff like that, maybe something you got from me even, the decimate modifier can be a huge help with lowering the amount of topology on your model, and then you would just apply that. And again, as long as you have a duplicate of your old scene, and you can experiment with this. Something I mentioned earlier was that I deleted a lot of the geometry on the Ava because that's not really something you're gonna see. But if you need to keep going, then keep going. So let's say that you really never see the chest, almost never see the chest. So I know that you only really see it at the end here. I'm gonna select it, and through my camera view, uncheck unlock, zoom all the way out, and now the camera is there. That's where it ends. I never see anything else. With the object selected, with the chest selected, I'm going to tab into edit mode, and this is probably going to be, a lot of geometry. And I'm going to go to X-ray mode, and I'm going to just box select all of this stuff down here. And again, this is kind of leaning into the more dramatic things to do to really optimize your scenes. I call this stage the chop stage. Just start chopping stuff, going through, box selecting geo and deleting it. So here I've deleted a ton of geo, a ton of faces. As far as the camera can see, everything looks good. It looks kind of, silly. It's like a crop top Ava now, but at least for the scene, for what the camera sees, and then turn up the passepartout here, it doesn't make a difference because the camera never sees outside of that. And I can do this more dramatically, more drastically with other parts like the arms and the shoulder blades and even some of the buildings. You can kind of get away with really like fudging things and kind of hiding things and making things be like floating and not really there. So things I've done in the past is I've even gone as far as like, okay, look at this building here. You only really see the front of it, the front kind of side of it. And so you kind of go through and you start kind of chopping stuff up. I'm going to grab like these faces, I don't know, and I'm going to delete the faces. This model is pretty well optimized. It's not like a ton of geo and stuff in it, but doing things like this, and this is the kind of stuff they do in video games where like, you get out of bounds of a video game and then you realize the mountain is just like half of a mountain and then behind it, it's nothing. It's a lot of that kind of stuff. You start really just deleting the things that the camera is never going to see. And if you do that well enough and throughout your scene, throughout your models, I could even go and delete like the whole back half of this Ava, like this all, and then delete it. You can't even tell because you never see that part. So this is stuff that you kind of do at the very end. Once you're set in your scene, you know what you're going to have, you know what's going to look like. Okay, so I jumped into cycles for this and you can see my settings here. Since I didn't use cycles to render this, so I'm going to disable these two first. And then here, what I was mentioning earlier about messing with the max bounces, this is set to 12, 4, 4, 12. Transmission, it doesn't need to be that high. It can actually be, I'll just make it 1 because I don't have anything that in this scene that's going to need that effect. And then this I can bring down to 4. Didn't notice a certain difference at all. Let's start bringing down the diffuse. Let's bring down to 1. Let's see what happens. Let's start bringing all this down and bring this down to 1. Yeah, I'm not really noticing a major difference in the final look. The volume that I have turned on here, I can turn this to 1 as well. And it doesn't look that different. And the scene kind of runs okay. Grab this cube. Hide that. So in cycles, the volumetrics can really increase the render times of your scenes. You know, if that's something you can avoid, if you can use like a Z depth or something instead of using volumetrics, then that can help a lot. Yeah, like this is already running pretty good. Even for me, I think this is running pretty good. In terms of like your scene and your scene being slow and like your actual render times of your scene after you've applied all the settings, you got to start looking at chopping some geometry, hiding things that are not being seen by the camera, turning off the volume, or maybe using some other alternative methods to fake the volume. And then the kind of last thing I want to mention, and this is something that I do if I'm rendering an animation and let's say there's a ton of layers in there, or maybe even something like this where the camera is kind of moving and there's like things in front of the camera, there's things behind those things. You can render in layers, and I'm going to show you a cool trick using a plane and turning it into a holdout. So I'm gonna add a plane, just gonna make it really, really big. And I'm gonna go into the object settings for the plane, and I don't have any material applied to it. I'm gonna go into the visibility and I'm gonna enable holdout. If I go into my render settings and select transparent, what that's gonna do is that's gonna make that plane act as a kind of like invisible shield. Now, when you render your scene, or if I was to render this, you can see that it'll render all of this stuff and then everything behind it is transparent. So then I can render in layers. So I can render this layer, 300 frames. Then I can take all of these buildings, hide them, put them in a collection where they're hidden, and then bring this one over here, like just behind the Ava, and then render just that layer like this. And then take all of this, hide it, and then just render this background building. So then I would have 3 renders essentially, and then I would just drop those into my to my editing software and just put them together. If I'm rendering just this background, for example, I only need to render from frame 83 to frame 300. So it's less frames that I'm rendering. And then on average, you just render less frames and things take less time. So all of that being said, with all of those things that I've mentioned, adjusting settings, deleting things, all of that stuff is, I would say, is optional, is up to your discretion, depending on what's important to you, how desperate you are to optimize your scene, and then, how comfortable you feel doing it. If you don't feel comfortable deleting your geo and rendering with less samples, then don't do that. Do what is important to you and do as what's important for you to get the result that you want. If you're not willing to compromise on any of this stuff, then I guess just your only option is really to just get a better computer and then maybe try a render farm. So yeah, that's everything I have to offer in terms of decreasing render times, optimizing your scene. If you try some of these things out, let me know how they work for you. Hopefully they do. And if you have suggestions for other things that maybe I didn't mention or things that have helped you that I didn't mention, share them, share them with the community, leave a comment. Hopefully I was able to help. Follow me on Patreon, support me on there. If you want to see longer videos, all these kinds of things, asset files, wallpapers, all that stuff is on there. If you want to just kind of follow my work, just follow me on Insta. Other than that, thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one. Peace.